Hey guys, it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens, and today we are harvesting potatoes. Specifically, we're harvesting my container potatoes. I planted these guys from seed potatoes all the way back in May, and they are definitely ready for harvest today. They were probably ready for harvest back a few weeks ago. I just didn't have the time to do it, but I do today. So one of the great things about growing potatoes, especially potatoes in containers, is you do have some flexibility on that harvest time as long as you're keeping the plant watered and keeping temperatures appropriate. The biggest risk that you can run is actually harvesting them too early. Now, if you harvest a potato too early, you will notice it's kind of a harder type texture and it might be a little bit more fibrous. Also, there's going to be fewer potatoes for you to harvest versus if you harvest them at maturity, you'll be able to have your maximum yield. Your potatoes will be the right consistency and that flavor will be kind of spot on with that starchiness as well. So these have been growing for about 3 to 4 months and they're definitely at maturity. Let's start with just a couple signs of how I know that these are ready to harvest. So I have my potato plant right here in front of me, and as you can see, there's all of these dead looking branches that have either flopped over or totally dried up. The consistency of these leaves is that of a dead plant. You would certainly look at this plant and think, that plant is dead. And for all intents and purposes, it really is. It's done producing at this point. It flowered well over a month ago, and as soon as those flowers started dying off, that's when I started to see the decline of the remainder of this foliage. I don't like to harvest right after flowering. I like to let it go just a couple more weeks to make sure that I'm getting the maximum yield that I can get from my potato plants. So despite the fact that this plant has looked somewhat dead for a couple weeks, I've made sure to keep it consistently watered without waterlogging those roots, which can of course cause root rot or tuber rot, which would rot your potatoes down below. This container in general feels pretty heavy. I suspect that there's quite a few potatoes waiting in here for us. So let's head on over to our wagon so we can see what's inside. One great thing about growing potatoes in containers is when it comes time to harvest, it's super easy to just go ahead and flip the entire container over so you can sift through and make sure that you're gathering all of the potatoes from your yield. So let's go ahead and tip this guy upside down and see what he has to offer. This does a nice job of showing just kind of how those potatoes are growing on the vines here. Now, don't ignore these little small guys, and I'll tell you about that in just a bit, but definitely harvest these little guys. That was our harvest for our first container potato. Let's take a look at what the second one has to offer. So I have my freshly harvested potatoes in these two containers alongside me. I would say in total, I probably got about 10 pounds worth of potatoes. Depending on the potato variety and how you grow them, you can expect to get about 5 to 10 potatoes from every seed potato that you plant. So I planted 2 to 3 seed potatoes in each one of my containers that I just harvested there. And I got about 25 to 30 additional potatoes, not including the really tiny ones that I'm going to reuse as seed potatoes. In all, this was a pretty decent harvest for me. Certainly not the largest harvest that I've ever had, but this specific type of red skin potato is one of my favorites. I'll link it in the description below. It's super soft and tender. We leave the skin right on it every time we cook them. And so for this type of potato, I'm okay with getting a slightly smaller yield because I know that I love the outcome of the potato so much. Our next step now that we've harvested these potatoes is going to be to cure them. And curing them simply means that we really want that outer skin to toughen up just a little bit so that it will store for a certain amount of time on the shelf before we use them. My method of curing today is going to be in the sun. Just know that you can also do the same method of curing in a dark, cool place. You'll need to do it for about 2 weeks. Today we're going to cure these in the sun. So today I'm going to take all of these potatoes and get them in a single layer on this sunny table. Now I'm going to leave these out in the sun to cure for about 2 to 3 hours. My goal is that I want to toughen up that skin on the outer layer, and I also want all of the dirt that's on these to be completely dry so I can brush it off. After these are done curing, I'm not going to wash them until I'm ready to use them. This is a key thing to keep in mind if you want these to store on the shelf for any amount of time. So if you're using them today, by all means, go ahead and scrub them up and get them ready. If you're not going to use these potatoes today, then definitely leave a little layer of dirt right on them. It will really help them keep in a cool, dark place for much longer. After I've let these potatoes cure and I've brushed off some of the excess dirt but left that initial layer on, I'm going to go ahead and get ready to store them. So for me, I usually like to store my potatoes for 2 to 3 weeks. That's about how long it takes for my family to consume them. I use the paper bag method. So just a plain brown paper bag does really, really well for potato storage. You can also use a burlap sack. A brown cardboard box would also work well. What you want to keep in mind is you want something that'll keep the light from hitting these potatoes, but will still allow good airflow. And brown paper bags are one of the cheapest and easiest ways to do that because they do still allow some good airflow to circulate around those potatoes, but they prevent any light from hitting the skin of those potatoes. When stored in a dark, cool place, and by cool, I mean somewhere between 38 and 40 degrees is preferable. You can kind of get up into 50, but just know that that will reduce the amount of shelf life that your potatoes have. When stored at 38 to 40 degrees, you can usually get several weeks of shelf life out of your potatoes before you start to see those sprout. One thing to keep in mind, anytime you notice a green tinge to your potato, this is especially noticeable on lighter skinned potatoes, that is solanine. Solanine is a chemical reaction that happens when the sun hits the skin of the potato. It can often happen to potatoes that are too close to the surface of your soil or potatoes that are exposed to sunlight for too long. That is technically a mild toxin. It's not something that's going to kill you. It is something that's probably going to upset your stomach. And if you have younger children, I definitely recommend avoiding that at all costs. However, if you do notice any green tinged potatoes, pull them out of your batch. It doesn't mean the entire batch is ruined by any means. It just means that that specific potato was exposed to sunlight at some point during the growth process. Now, earlier in the video, I did mention don't underestimate the power of these little baby potatoes here, because guess what these are going to turn into? My seed potatoes for next year. So in another video, I'm going to explain to you how I use these as seed potatoes, what I do for the curing process on these, and how I store them long term until spring arrives for me next year. If you're new to growing potatoes, welcome. This is going to be one of the easiest plants that you can grow out in your garden, so I highly, highly recommend it. If you're specifically interested in growing potatoes in containers, please know that I have a couple videos on this process, specifically the plants that I actually harvested today. I did another video earlier this spring when I initially potted those up, and another video on how I hill my potatoes in containers as well. Again, potatoes are so easy to grow, they're so fulfilling, so rewarding, and the produce actually lasts on the shelf for quite a while, which gives you some time to use it up in your house, because nothing is more devastating than when your own produce that you grew yourself goes to waste on your kitchen counter. That's all I have for you on this short and sweet video about harvesting potatoes today. Tune in soon and I'll have my video on harvesting and establishing seed potatoes ready for you soon. If you have any questions for me on my processes for growing, hilling, or harvesting potatoes, please leave them in the comments section below. Thank you so much for spending some time on our channel today. It sure does help small businesses like ours so much. As always, I appreciate you tuning in with us today, and I sure hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye.